yay. It's not for the story that I'm about to read, but it's a picture from one of the prior ones. A story that was called, I think it was The Green Knight. That sounds right. Let me just double check. Yeah, The Green Knight. It was one of the first stories that I had read. It might be on the Danish myths one. I'm not sure. But yes, if you were interested in seeing the pictures, I plan on putting that picture as one of the ones on this video, since I had just found it before getting to this one. Okay, let's see. Sorry, I had walked away from here for 1 second, or well, for more than a second. I decided to do some sweeping. The house that I live in, it has a little like courtyards, and that would be an overstatement of the section I'm talking about, but it's the best way I can think to explain it. It's like a very small contained area that has a fence around it, where the back door is, and there's a tree that grows there with acorns, and it drops its leaves and acorns all around this miniaturized courtyard. And eventually my need to, my human need to manicure the environment to my particular expectations takes over, and I have to go out there and sweep it. So yeah, I was just sweeping, and now I'm not. Now I'm whispering, so let me do just that. This tale that I'm about to read is called Miracle. There was once a king who married when very young, and whose life was extremely happy. But his happiness only lasted a short time, for after he had been married about a year, he lost his beloved wife, who died soon after giving birth to a little girl. When she knew that death was near, she asked the king to promise her to remain a widower for 7 years, and if at the end of that time he wanted to marry again, he should choose no other woman as his wife than the one his daughter should wish to have for her mother. This the king promised to his wife. Soon after that she died, to his great grief, for they had always been devoted to each other and had lived very happily together. A nurse was found for the little princess, who grew in mind and body, and the nurse was so good and kind, and so full of motherly care and tenderness for the royal child, that it seemed that it would have been impossible for a mother to have been more loving. And the princess grew to love her nurse as if she were her own mother. But all this apparent love on the part of the nurse was nothing but clever calculation and dissimulation. For as the child grew older, the woman would often say how sad it would be for them both when they had to separate, and how beautiful it would be if they could always live together. When the princess had attained her 7th year, the nurse spoke out without any attempt at concealment, and said that probably her father, the king, would soon ask her to advise him whom to marry, and to tell him whom she would prefer to have as her mother. And to this she must answer that she loved her nurse best, because otherwise she might have a stepmother who would be unkind to her. And everything came to pass as the crafty nurse had expected. Soon after the princess was 7 years old, she asked her father to marry the nurse. This he did, as he believed that he had to fulfill the promise that he had made to his wife. And so the nurse became queen. But from that moment all the love that she had pretended to feel for the princess vanished utterly. The queen herself had a daughter, whom she now brought to court, and who tried to supplant the king's daughter wherever possible. Besides that, the wicked stepmother did everything that she could to make the king hate his own child. Every day she would accuse the poor girl of some bad thing that she had never done. The king heard nothing but good of his stepdaughter, nothing but evil of his own daughter. He often scolded her, but did not lose his affection for her. Nevertheless, the princess grew timid, began to fear her father, and appeared before him as little as possible. Matters stood thus when the princess was 15 years old, and to make things worse for her, it happened that the king had to go away for a time to wage war against another country. During his absence, the queen was to rule and to conduct the affairs of state, but the wicked woman spent much time trying to devise ways and means to separate the father and daughter permanently, so that the princess would be put entirely out of the way, and the queen's daughter be able to take her place. Now, in spite of her ingenuity, the wicked queen could not think of any plan by which to accomplish her purpose, and she was in a very bad humor because she had learned that the king was soon to return. One day, while she was walking in the woods, deep in her evil thoughts, she met an old witch, who asked her why she was so depressed, and wanted to know whether she could not help her. The queen told her trouble to the witch, who promised to find a way out of it if she would meet her at the same spot the next day. The queen went to the place appointed and found the witch waiting her. The old woman had in the meantime milked all the wild animals of the forest, and had made of this milk a small cheese, which she gave to the queen. This cheese she was to give to her stepdaughter to eat, but the princess must eat it of her own free will, else it would avail nothing. The queen took the cheese home and laid it in a place where the princess would be sure to see it. And as soon as the princess had seen the cheese, she exclaimed, "What a nice little cheese! I must taste it." And it tasted so good that she ate it all. But soon she began to feel ill, and day by day she lost her beauty. When the king came home, the queen went to meet her, and immediately asked her about his daughter. Then the hypocritical woman looked sad and begged the king not to be too angry with his daughter, or to deal too harshly with her, but really it could not be denied that she had behaved very badly during his absence. Then the king sent for the princess. He did not speak a word to her, but ordered 2 of his faithful servants to put her in a carriage, take her far into the woods where no human beings ever came. Then they were to kill her, and as proof that they had fulfilled his command, they were to bring to him her heart, her little finger, and her blood-soaked garments. The poor princess did not know what her father's refusal to speak to her meant, but she was conscious of nothing but that she felt very sick and miserable. Then the servants took her deep into the woods, where they told her that she must die as her father the king had commanded. But the princess begged the servants to spare her life, and promised them that she would never go back to her father's kingdom. Then they had compassion on her and said that they would spare her life, so they killed a young deer that had broken its leg and cut out its heart. They also soaked some of the garments of the princess in blood, and then she had to sacrifice one of her little fingers. The servants now went back to the palace with the bloody proofs, while the princess went deeper and deeper into the forest. It was an immense forest which separated the king's realm from another country, and she continued to walk until she came out on the other side. But all the animals of the forest flocked about her, deer, hares, foxes, but especially the wild beasts. All these it seemed as if the girl were one of themselves. They did her no harm, but swarmed around her so that she could hardly go forward, and all the time she was in terror lest they should tear her to pieces. The princess hurried on as fast as she could, but towards evening she was exhausted and sank down under a tree. After a short rest, she summoned her remaining strength and climbed up into the tree in order to be able to spend the night safe from the unwelcome attentions of the animals. Once in the tree, the princess found a large hollow place where she was able to recline and be comfortable, and soon she fell asleep and slept sweetly until daybreak. When she awoke, she was trembling with cold, but felt wonderfully strengthened and refreshed by her sleep, and when she looked at herself, she found that she looked as she did before her illness. The joy of the princess was very great, and she hastened down from the tree and went to the edge of the forest where she could look out into the open country. But as her eyes wandered over the strange landscape, her loneliness and sad condition were borne in upon her more than ever, and she burst into tears and prayed to God to help her in her distress. Just then the young woman heard a voice behind her, which said, "Here I am, mother, wait and take me with you." She looked all about her, but could see nothing but a little black dog that came running toward her, barking and wagging his tail. And he it was that had called her mother. "You must call me Miracle," he said, "and you need not weep or have any more care, for I shall see that you lack nothing." Miracle went in advance and led the princess back for a short distance into the forest, until they reached a hill covered with beautiful shade trees, and from which a little brook bubbled forth. "Little mother," asked Miracle, "would you not like to live here?" "Yes, indeed," she replied, "but what am I to live in?" "You will see in a few minutes." And thereupon Miracle dug with his paws and bit branches from the trees with his sharp teeth, and soon he had built a neat little cottage. Then he collected a pile of dry grass and leaves and said, "Lie down a little while and rest, mother. I shall soon be back again." The land that the princess could see from her hill was ruled by a prince, who was the neighbor of her father. The forest through which she had passed was the boundary between their dominions, and not far from her cottage was the royal palace where the prince lived. The little black dog ran to the palace, and all the gates and doors opened, as soon as he scratched them with his little paws. Then he went to the housekeeper of the palace and said, "My name is Miracle, and I want you to give me some bedclothes and pillows for my mother. She's out in the woods and is cold." Then the housekeeper threw him some old rags, but he would not touch them. "Keep your rags," he said, and running to the bedroom of the prince, he took the bedclothes that were on his bed and ran back to the princess. "There, mother," he said, "now make your bed while I go out and get you something to eat." Then the little black dog ran back to the palace and went into the kitchen. "My name is Miracle," he said, "and I want some food for my mother who is starving in the woods." Then the cook threw him some bones. "Keep those bones," said the dog. "I would not condescend to accept anything from you." Jumping up on the kitchen table, he seized the silver platter containing a roast intended for the prince, and carried both off to the princess in the woods. "I'll come right back," he said, and again ran to the palace. This time Miracle ran to the wine cellar of the palace and brought back the drinking horn of the prince, filled with the finest wine. For a long time the princess lived in her little cottage on the hill, while Miracle brought her all that she needed from the palace of the prince. Until now we have only spoken of 2 kingdoms, but there was still another one, situated beyond the prince's country. Over this land ruled an old king who had 3 daughters, each one of whom seemed to be uglier and more malicious than the others. They would have liked to marry, but their father insisted that they should accept no one of a rank lower than prince. But no suitors presented themselves, and so the years went by, and the princesses became older and uglier and more malicious. Now it happened that the prince from whose palace Miracle brought all the good things was a young unmarried man, whose realm was much smaller than that of his neighbor, the old king. One day the king sent an embassy to the prince to inquire whether he would not like to marry one of his daughters. He could choose the one that he preferred. The prince sent back a reply that he did not want to marry any one of them. That was a great insult to the old king, who swore that he would be avenged, so he declared war against the prince, whose land he invaded with his army. A battle was fought, in which the king was victorious and the prince taken prisoner. He was thrown into a dungeon, where he was kept for several days. Then came a messenger from the king, and said, "My lord, the king has commanded me to inform you that you deserve to suffer death for the insult that you have offered him. Nevertheless, he is willing to show you mercy, and grant you your life and land on condition that you marry one of his daughters." But the prince answered him curtly that he would never do this, and that, as he had not done it voluntarily, he would certainly not do it under compulsion. So sentence of death was passed, and the day of his execution fixed. While the prince was sitting sad and lonely in his dungeon, a little dog came suddenly to him. It was none other than our acquaintance, Miracle. He spoke to the prince and asked him whether he would not like to leave his prison. "Of course I would," answered the young man. "Well," said Miracle, "if you will marry my mother, I can and will set you free." "Your mother," said the princess. "Who and what is she, and what does she look like?" "My name is Miracle, and that is her name also, for we are of the same blood." "Oh, I thank you," said the prince. "Marry a dog? I will not do that any more than I would marry one of those malicious old princesses." Immediately Miracle vanished, But the day before the execution he again appeared before the prince and said, "Well, have you reflected and made up your mind whether you will marry my mother and gain your life, freedom, and realm? Otherwise, as you well know, all will be over tomorrow. If she were only a woman and not one of those wretched old princesses, I would marry her and thus win my freedom and land. But dog, that is not to be thought of." "As you are willing to marry my mother," said Miracle, "you must have her bridal robes made at once, and have her measure taken by a dressmaker." When the prince heard that, he no longer refused, for he knew that his bride must be a human being. Nevertheless, it seemed strange to him that the dog should speak of having wedding robes made, when it was evident from the position of the prince that he could not attend to such matters. The next day, the execution was to take place. Soldiers were sent to the tower to fetch the prince and lead him to the place of execution, where the gallows had been erected and the hangman was waiting. As the prisoner was led up to the gallows, Miracle ran between the legs of the guards and called out, "Either set the prince free at once and take him home to his realm, or I will tear you all to pieces, for he is to marry mother." But they called him an impudent puppy and laughed him to scorn, and the executioner gave him a kick. Then, however, Miracle became angry and showed them what he could do. He rushed at the bystanders and tore them to pieces, and soon not only the hangman and soldiers, but also the king and all his court lay dead around the gallows. The Miracle went back with the prince to his realm, and did not stop until they reached the little cottage on the hill where the princess lived. A strange feeling came over the prince as he followed the dog, but as soon as he entered the cabin and saw the beautiful princess, a great weight seemed to fall from his heart. With joy he greeted her as his betrothed and declared that their wedding should be celebrated in 3 days. The Miracle said to the prince, "You are at liberty to invite anybody you please to the wedding, but I reserve the right to invite one single guest." Permission was granted him, and the guest he asked was none other than the father of the princess. The Miracle continued and said, "After the marriage ceremony you will sit down to the wedding feast, and I will come sit under the table next to the guest whom I have invited. Every time that he wants to partake of the food that is placed before him, I shall jump up and take it away from him. For a time he will not say anything, but take something else. At last, however, he will become angry and ask whether you are trying to make a fool of him. Then you must say that you are sorry that he has been offended by anyone in your palace, even if it were but your dog, and that you are willing that he should draw his sword and kill the animal if it should annoy him again. Now promise me that you will comply with my request." The prince promised, and sent out messengers to invite the guests, and made preparations for the wedding. The day came, and the marriage was celebrated with great pomp and splendor. The bride, with her golden crown on her head, was radiant with happiness, and indeed fair to gaze upon. But of course her father did not recognize her, for he thought her dead, and besides, he had not seen her since her 15th year. And Little Black Dog came and seated himself at the feet of the old king, and every time that he wanted to partake of any food, the dog snapped it away from him. For a time the king said nothing, but at last he lost his patience and said that he had not come to this wedding to be made a fool of. The dog had surely been brought in to annoy him, for it was certainly not the custom to allow dogs in a royal banquet hall. Then the bridegroom answered that he regretted deeply that the dog had acted thus towards the royal guest, and that much as he loved the animal, he was quite willing that the king should punish him as he saw fit. The king in a rage drew his sword and split the dog's skull, and suddenly in his place stood a handsome little boy who said, "Here I am, grandfather. Take me in your arms and carry me to my mother, who is sitting at the end of the table." The old king arose as if in a dream, but nevertheless he did as the boy had bidden him, and carried him to the bride, in whom he recognized his daughter, whom he had once commanded to be killed. Then the child told the whole story of the wickedness of the old king's wife, and of what had happened to the princess, and all were glad that her troubles were at an end. Then the king gave orders to a messenger to go back to his kingdom, and say that the wicked queen and her daughter should be driven from the palace into the great forest. This was done, and they were never heard of again, for the wild beasts tore them to pieces and devoured them. Now, I like that story. I'm very curious about Miracle. Just as lack of suspension of belief thing that I was talking about before. But very cool. I like that one. Alright. I'm gonna go ahead and stop this recording for now, and hopefully I'll manage to start on the next one momentarily. Give me 1 second.